So the House Intelligence Committee has wrapped up its public hearings. Probably, there's still, I guess, the theoretical possibility they'll call more witnesses. That doesn't seem likely. So assuming that doesn't happen, what happens now with impeachment? Well, the Intelligence Committee would then kick this over to the Judiciary Committee. They would decide if they want to put actual articles of impeachment together, things they would want to charge the president with, high crimes and misdemeanors they would want to charge the president with. The Judiciary Committee would decide if they want to do that. They would put the articles together. They would then vote the articles out of the committee. They would take votes on each individual article they came up with. The full House would then have floor debate, and then the full House would vote on whether to adopt the articles of impeachment. If even one of them is adopted, then the president is impeached. It would go over to the U.S. Senate. A group of House members would be designated as managers. They would serve as prosecutors, and they would go over to the U.S. Senate. Senate would hold a trial. The senators would act as jury members. Witnesses would be called. Evidence would be presented. The Senate would deliberate. They might deliberate behind closed doors with no cameras on. That's what happened in the Clinton impeachment back in 1999. And then finally there would be a vote, and you would need a 2/3 super majority to convict Trump and remove him from office. The question from these hearings, of course, was, did the politics change at all? Democrats held these hearings in part because they thought having these witnesses testify in front of all the cameras with the country watching, would it change public opinion? We're going to wait to see polling come out in the days that follow these hearings. So far, there's been no indication of a major decisive move one way or the other on this. And Republican members of Congress are well aware that for Donald Trump, the story of his entire presidency has been he has had very high support from Republican voters, from their own party's voters. And there's been a great fear among Republican members of Congress of being on the wrong side of that opinion in their own party. We have seen Republicans in the Trump era who have gotten in Trump's crosshairs, who have gotten into big trouble in Republican primaries. So that's a very powerful motivating force on the Republican side. And if you look at polls right now of Republican voters on impeachment, it's still essentially 7% Republicans support impeachment, 8%, 6%. The vast majority of Republicans, 90% plus generally, are opposed to impeachment, still support President Trump. As long as you see numbers like that, it is hard to see Republicans in measurable numbers breaking with him. And it's a huge contrast. You think of a Republican president a couple decades ago, Richard Nixon, who was driven out of office. He was facing impeachment, chose to resign in the face of that. Well, when Nixon resigned in August 1974, if you took a poll of Republicans, it was split right down the middle. 45% of Republicans at that point said they wanted Nixon impeached. 44% said they were against it. With numbers like that, with that kind of split opinion in his own party, there was plenty of room for Republicans to break with Nixon to also call for his impeachment. But with Trump, it's like 90-6. There was one Republican member folks were watching closely. His name is Will Hurd, Republican from Texas. He's from a district, a Hillary Clinton district in 2016. He has been very critical of Donald Trump. He's not running for re-election in 2020. So the general sense is that Will Hurd was a barometer. If you're looking at a Republican who on paper would be likely to break with Trump, Will Hurd would be at the top of that list or near the top of that list.
An impeachable offense should be compelling, overwhelmingly clear, and unambiguous, and it's not something to be rushed or taken lightly. I've not heard evidence proving the president committed bribery or extortion.
If Will Hurd ends these hearings after listening to all those witnesses in the Intelligence Committee and lands at not impeachable, it seems a pretty good indication that on the Republican side, support for the president coming out of these Intelligence Committee hearings, it remains strong enough probably to keep him from being removed from office.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.